They bound the man who had just saved them, and by sunset, 200 warriors stood in silence waiting for him to speak. The rope around Ethan Calloway's wrists was pulled tight, rough fibers biting into skin already worn by years of reins and rifle grips, and still he didn't resist, not when they forced him down into the dust, not when the circle closed around him, not even when the wind shifted and carried the low murmur of voices he couldn't understand but didn't need to, because judgment sounded the same in every language out here, slow, heavy, final. The land stretched wide and empty beyond them, red earth broken by sage and stone, the last light of the day spilling across the canyon walls like fire dying slowly, and in that light every figure around him looked carved from something older than law, older than the uniform folded in his saddlebag a mile back, older than the name he used to answer to. Someone stepped forward, boots silent against the dirt, and dropped something at his knees, a small object, metal catching the fading sun, a soldier's badge, bent, darkened, marked by a stain that no river had ever fully washed away. Ethan's eyes lingered on it just long enough to remember, then moved away like a man who had already paid for that memory and had nothing left to offer. The circle tightened. One man spoke, voice low, steady, carrying weight, and though Ethan couldn't catch the words, he understood the question. He had heard it before, in different places, from different mouths, always the same meaning. "What did you do?" He didn't answer. The wind pushed dust across the ground between them, thin lines tracing paths no one could follow, and somewhere behind the warriors a horse shifted, leather creaking, a reminder that the world kept moving even when men stopped to decide another man's fate. Ethan lifted his head slowly, meeting their eyes one by one, not defiant, not pleading, just present, the way a man stands when running is no longer an option worth considering. He had seen them earlier that day from the ridge, moving through the valley in quiet formation, not like raiders, not like soldiers, but like people who belonged to the land in a way he never would, and he had turned his horse without thinking, riding hard to reach them before the dust cloud rising miles behind could close the distance, before the men wearing the same badge now lying in the dirt could find them first. He had spoken then, fast, careful, hands open, telling them what was coming, how many, how soon, where the river narrowed and where the cliffs would trap them if they didn't move, and for a moment, just a moment, he thought they might listen. But warnings sound different when they come from the mouth of the man who once rode with the ones you're being warned about. A woman moved through the circle now, her presence shifting something in the air without a single word spoken, and the warriors stepped aside for her not out of fear, but out of something steadier, something chosen. Nayeli. He didn't know her name yet, but he felt it in the way the others watched her, in the way even the wind seemed to pause as she stopped a few feet in front of him, eyes fixed, sharp, reading him like a trail that might lead somewhere dangerous. She didn't look at the badge first. She looked at him. At the dust on his coat, the wear on his boots, the way his hands stayed still even when the rope cut deeper as he shifted his weight. Then, slowly, she crouched, fingers brushing the metal at his knees, lifting it just enough for the last light to catch the mark etched into its surface, a mark she knew, a mark many of them knew, because it had been seen before on men who brought orders instead of questions. The murmurs grew louder, tension rising like heat off stone, and one of the warriors stepped forward, voice harder now, sharper, pointing toward the badge, then toward Ethan, accusation clear even without translation. Ethan exhaled once, slow, controlled, the kind of breath a man takes before stepping into cold water, and when he finally spoke, his voice was quiet, carrying just far enough to reach the woman in front of him. "I was there. Nothing more. No defense. No explanation. Just truth, laid bare and left where it fell." The reaction was immediate, a ripple through the circle, hands tightening, shoulders squaring, the space around him shrinking as if the ground itself had decided he had already said enough. Nayeli didn't move right away. Her eyes stayed on his, searching not for the words he hadn't said, but for the ones he had chosen not to, and in that silence something shifted, small, almost invisible, but real enough to hold back what might have come next. Then, from the ridge above, a thin line of smoke rose into the darkening sky, distant but unmistakable, and every head turned at once, every body angling toward the horizon where the last light now caught the faint outline of movement, more than a handful, more than a dozen, a line growing where there had been none before. The air changed. Judgment could wait. Survival could not. The smoke did not rise like a signal meant to be seen, it climbed slow and thin, the kind of trail men missed unless they were already looking for it, and every warrior in the circle saw it at the same time, their stillness breaking not into chaos but into movement that carried purpose, quiet and precise, like a river changing course without warning. Ethan felt the shift before he saw it, the tension around him loosening just enough to change its shape, no longer focused entirely on him, now stretching outward toward the ridge where the horizon had begun to darken with something more than evening light. The man who had spoken before stepped back, his gaze no longer fixed on Ethan but scanning the distance, calculating, counting, and somewhere behind them a voice called out, short, sharp, answered immediately by another farther away, a chain forming in seconds without confusion. Nayeli straightened, the badge still in her hand, her eyes following the line of smoke as it drifted higher, then she looked down at Ethan again, not with softness, not with trust, but with something closer to decision. She stepped closer, close enough that he could see the fine dust caught in the strands of her dark hair, the way her shoulders held steady even as the air around them tightened, and when she spoke, her English was careful but clear, shaped by use rather than comfort. "How far," she asked, her voice low, direct, "before they reach this valley?" Ethan did not look away from her when he answered, because there was no advantage left in hiding what he knew, and time had a way of stripping men down to the truth whether they wanted it or not. "If they keep the pace I saw," he said, steady, measured, "less than 2 hours, maybe less if they push through the river bend." A murmur moved through the warriors again, sharper this time, and one of them stepped forward, gesturing toward Ethan with a motion that carried both anger and warning, but Nayeli lifted a hand without turning, and the man stopped where he stood, the gesture enough. She crouched again, setting the badge back in the dust between them, not discarding it, not returning it, simply placing it where both of them could see it, then she met his eyes once more. "You wore this," she said, not a question, just a statement anchored in fact. Ethan nodded once. "I did." The wind picked up slightly, carrying the scent of dry earth and distant water, and for a moment neither of them spoke, the silence holding weight that did not need to be filled. Then she asked the question that mattered. "Why did you come here?" Ethan let out a breath that felt older than the day itself, his gaze shifting past her for a second, toward the ridge where the smoke still marked the sky, before returning to her. "Because they are not going to stop," he said, his voice quiet but firm, "and I know how they move, where they think you will run, where they expect you to hide, and if you stay here, they will find you before the night is over." The words settled into the space between them, heavy, undeniable, and for the first time since they had bound his hands, the circle did not close tighter around him. Instead, it opened, just slightly, just enough for possibility to exist. Nayeli stood again, turning away from him as she spoke in her own language, her voice carrying farther now, stronger, and the warriors responded without hesitation, some moving toward the horses, others toward the edges of the valley, their actions forming a pattern that spoke of years of survival, of knowing when to stand and when to move. Ethan watched them with a kind of still attention, not as an outsider trying to understand, but as a man. Recognizing something familiar in the way they prepared, the same quiet efficiency he had seen in men who expected to be tested before sunrise. A shadow passed over him as someone stepped closer, and he felt hands at the rope around his wrists again, not cutting it, not yet, but loosening it just enough that the strain eased, the fibers no longer biting as deep. He did not turn to see who it was. He did not need to. When the pressure lifted, he flexed his fingers once, slow, careful, then let them rest again, waiting. Nayeli returned a moment later, stopping a few steps away, her gaze sweeping over him as if measuring something that had not been there before. "You know a way," she said, and this time it was a question. Ethan nodded. "There is a pass through the canyon east of here, narrow, hard to see unless you know where to look, it cuts miles off the open ground, keeps you out of sight if you move before full dark." One of the warriors spoke sharply from behind her, his tone carrying doubt, challenge, and she answered him without looking away from Ethan, her voice calm but edged with authority, and the man fell silent. The last light of the day slipped lower, shadows stretching long across the valley floor, and the smoke on the ridge thickened just enough to confirm what none of them wanted to say out loud. Naeli stepped closer again, close enough that the space between them no longer felt like distance, and for a brief second her eyes dropped to the rope at his wrists, then lifted back to his face. "If you lie," she said, her voice steady, "we will not ask twice." Ethan gave the smallest nod, not in fear, not in defiance, just in acknowledgement. "I know." Another beat of silence passed, and then she reached down, pulling a small blade from her belt, the metal catching the last of the sun as she brought it up between them. For a moment it hovered near the rope, and the world seemed to narrow to that single point, the choice held there in her hand. Then, without ceremony, without announcement, she cut through the fibers in one clean motion, the rope falling away from his wrists into the dust below. Ethan did not move right away. He looked down at his freed hands, then back up at her, and in that exchange something shifted again, not trust, not yet, but something that could grow into it if the night ahead did not take it first. Behind them, the warriors were already moving, gathering what they needed, leaving behind what they could not carry, and the valley that had held them only minutes before was beginning to empty itself into the dark. Naeli stepped back, giving him space, but not turning away. "Then show us," she said. The first steps were the hardest, not because of the terrain but because every man and woman behind him watched the ground he chose like it might betray them, and Ethan could feel that weight with each boot print he left in the dust, the responsibility settling in his chest heavier than the rope that had just been cut from his wrists. He did not rush. Rushing was how men made mistakes in places like this, and mistakes out here did not ask twice. The sky above them dimmed from fire to ash, the last light slipping behind the canyon walls as shadows stretched long and thin, swallowing the valley piece by piece, and Ethan moved toward the eastern ridge without looking back, trusting that if they had chosen to follow him, they would not need to be told twice. The sound of movement behind him stayed quiet, controlled, no wasted motion, no panic, just the steady rhythm of people who had learned how to disappear when the land demanded it. He reached the base of the ridge and slowed, raising a hand slightly, not as a command but as a signal, then angled toward a narrow break in the rocks that would have looked like nothing more than a crack in the earth to anyone who had not spent years memorizing terrain under orders that never explained why. "This way," he said, his voice low, just enough to carry to those closest, and he stepped into the passage where the air cooled instantly, the walls of stone rising close on either side, cutting off the open sky. The path twisted almost immediately, bending in a way that erased the valley behind them within a dozen yards, and the ground shifted from loose dust to packed earth mixed with small stones that held footprints poorly, a detail he noticed. Without thinking, the kind of thing drilled into him until it became instinct. He paused briefly, crouching to brush the surface with his hand, testing the firmness, then stood again and kept moving, adjusting his pace so the group could pass through without bunching up, without leaving signs that would linger under moonlight. Somewhere behind him, a child's breath came a little too fast, and a woman murmured something soft in response, the sound carried forward just enough to remind him who he was leading and what would happen if he chose wrong. The passage narrowed further ahead, forcing them into a single line, and Ethan turned slightly, glancing back for the first time since they had left the valley, his eyes finding Naeli among them without effort, the way a man recognizes the one person who has the power to stop everything with a single word. She was watching him, not the ground, not the walls, but him, her expression unreadable in the fading light, and for a moment neither of them looked away. Then he turned back and continued, because there was nothing to say that would change what came next. The path climbed gradually, not steep enough to slow them, but enough to pull at the legs, and the air grew thinner, carrying the faint scent of water from somewhere beyond the ridge. Ethan knew that smell. It meant the pass would open soon, just as he remembered, just as he had hoped. Behind them, the sky darkened further, and though the canyon walls blocked the view, he did not need to see the ridge to know what was happening there. Men were moving. Orders were being given. Lines were forming. The kind of movement that did not stop once it started. He pushed the thought aside and focused on the ground ahead, on the exact placement of his feet, on the rhythm of his breathing, on anything that kept him in the moment instead of the past. The passage turned one final time, sharper than the others, and then it opened without warning into a narrow stretch of higher ground, a hidden path that ran along the side of the canyon, shielded from the valley below by a rise of rock that blended perfectly with the land. Ethan stepped out first, scanning the horizon quickly. Measuring distance, direction, the angle of the fading light, then nodded once to himself. "We stay here," he said quietly when Nayeli came up beside him, her presence felt before it was seen. "Move along this ridge, keep low, and we will be out of their line of sight before full dark." She followed his gaze, taking in the path, the way it curved along the canyon wall, the cover it provided, and for a moment she said nothing. The wind moved gently across the ridge, carrying the distant echo of something far behind them, too faint to be clear, but enough to confirm that time was no longer something they could spend. "You have walked this before," she said finally, not questioning, just stating what she had already decided. Ethan nodded. "A long time ago." Another silence settled between them, shorter this time, less heavy, and when she spoke again, her voice carried something new, not trust, not yet, but recognition. "Then you will walk it again," she said, and stepped forward to signal the others, her voice shifting back into her own language as the line adjusted, moving along the ridge with the same quiet discipline they had shown before. Ethan watched them for a second, the way they moved without breaking formation, the way they trusted her without needing to be told why, and something in his chest tightened in a way he had not felt in years. Then he turned and led the way again, the narrow path stretching ahead into the dark, each step carrying them farther from the valley and closer to whatever waited beyond the night. The ridge narrowed as the night settled in, not sudden but slow, like the land itself was deciding how much of them it would allow to pass, and Ethan adjusted his steps without breaking rhythm, lowering his center of gravity just enough to keep his balance steady on the uneven ground while the faint glow of the sky faded into a deep blue that swallowed distance and detail alike. The air cooled quickly at this elevation, carrying the quiet scent of stone and distant water, and behind him the line of figures moved with careful precision, each step placed where the one before had been, minimizing sound, minimizing trace, a discipline that spoke louder than any words they had not exchanged. Somewhere below, far beyond the ridge they now followed, a faint echo drifted upward, not clear enough to name, but familiar enough for Ethan to recognize the pattern of movement it carried, the slow advance of men who believed the land would give up its secrets if they pressed hard enough. He did not turn to look. He did not need to. Instead, he lifted a hand slightly as the path ahead curved tighter along the canyon wall, signaling a slower pace, allowing those behind him to adjust without breaking formation. A loose stone shifted under his boot, sliding just an inch before settling again, and he paused, not out of fear but out of habit, waiting long enough to ensure the sound did not carry farther than it should, then continued, each movement measured, deliberate. The ridge offered protection, but not forgiveness. One misstep here would not shout, but it would be heard by those who knew how to listen. A few yards behind, Nayeli moved with the same quiet certainty, her presence steady, her attention not fixed on the path alone but on the people moving through it, adjusting their spacing with small gestures, guiding without command, and when one of the younger boys hesitated at a narrow bend where the ground dipped slightly toward the open drop beyond the rocks, she stepped closer, placing a hand lightly on his shoulder, not pushing, not pulling, just enough contact to anchor him, and the boy moved forward again without a word. Ethan noticed it without looking directly, the way he noticed most things now, through the edges of his awareness, and something in that small moment stayed with him longer than it should have. The path climbed again, a gradual rise that tested endurance more than strength, and the group slowed naturally, breathing deep, controlled, conserving energy for what still lay ahead. Ethan counted the steps without meaning to, a habit he had never fully left behind, measuring distance not in miles but in rhythm, in the steady repetition of movement that kept a man focused when the dark tried to take that focus away. At the crest of the rise, he stopped, just long enough to scan the line of the ridge. Ahead, his eyes adjusting to the low light, picking out the subtle differences in shadow that marked the continuation of the path, then he stepped aside slightly, allowing Nayeli to come up beside him once more. She did not speak right away. She followed his gaze, reading the land as he did, seeing not just what was there but what it meant, the way the ridge dipped slightly before leveling out, the way the rock formation ahead created a natural cover point where they could pause without being exposed. "We rest there," Ethan said quietly, nodding toward the darker shape ahead, "only for a few minutes, just enough to keep the line strong." Naeli considered it for a moment, her eyes moving from the path to the people behind them, measuring their pace, their breathing, the subtle signs of strain that did not show in words, then she gave a small nod. "A few minutes," she repeated, and her voice carried just enough for the nearest to hear, the message passing down the line without breaking the silence. They reached the cover point in less than 5 minutes, the rock rising higher on one side, creating a shallow pocket that shielded them from both the valley below and the open sky above, and one by one, they settled briefly, not sitting fully, not relaxing completely, just enough to ease the weight from their legs and steady their breath. Ethan remained standing, his back to the rock, eyes scanning the path they had just taken, listening more than looking, the night offering sounds that daylight often hid, the whisper of wind along stone, the distant shift of something moving far below, the subtle difference between silence and the absence of it. Naeli stepped closer, stopping a few feet from him, her posture still alert even in rest, and for a moment they stood without speaking, the space between them no longer defined by distance but by something quieter, something that had begun to take shape without permission. "You did not have to come back," she said finally, her voice low, not accusing, not grateful, simply stating what had been true since the moment he had turned his horse toward the valley. Ethan kept his gaze on the darkness beyond the ridge as he answered. "I know." She watched him for a second longer, as if waiting for more, but he did not offer it, and after a moment, she nodded once, accepting the answer for what it was. The pause did not last long. It could not. Ethan straightened slightly, shifting his weight forward, his attention returning fully to the path ahead. "We move," he said quietly, and the words carried just enough to reach those closest, the signal passing once more without disruption. As they stepped back onto the narrow ridge, the night closed in around them, deeper now, heavier, but no longer empty. It held their movement, their purpose, and somewhere far behind, the faint echo of pursuit that had not yet caught up, but had not been left behind either. The ridge leveled out after another quarter mile, flattening just enough to ease the strain in their legs, but not enough to offer comfort, and Ethan slowed his pace again, listening more than looking, the night now thick around them, pressing close, carrying every small sound farther than it should. The wind shifted, subtle but clear, bringing with it a faint trace of something that did not belong to the land, a distant rhythm, not loud, not urgent, but steady, and Ethan knew that rhythm well enough to feel it settle in his chest before he spoke. "They are still behind us," he said quietly, not turning, his voice meant for Naeli alone. She stepped closer without breaking stride, her presence steady beside him. "How close?" she asked. Ethan paused for half a second, measuring what he could not see. "Far enough that we have time," he said, then added, "but not enough to make a mistake." The words stayed between them, simple, unadorned, carrying more weight than any longer explanation could have. Ahead, the ridge dipped slightly, then curved inward toward a narrow stretch where the rock rose higher on both sides, creating a natural corridor that funneled the path forward. Ethan recognized it immediately. A choke point. Not for fighting. For decisions. He stopped at the entrance, lifting his hand again, and the line behind him slowed to stillness without a single voice raised. The air here felt different, cooler, quieter, as if the stone itself held its breath. Naeli moved up beside him, her eyes tracing the shape of the passage, reading it the way he had. "This place," she said softly. Ethan nodded. "If they find the trail, this is where they will look to gain ground," he replied. She glanced back once at her people, then forward again. "And us?" Ethan did not answer right away. He stepped into the corridor, walking a few yards ahead, studying the ground, the walls, the way the shadows settled into the edges, then he turned back toward her. "We pass through," he said, "but we do not all move the same way." The idea hung there, incomplete, waiting. Naeli watched him closely. "Say it," she said. Ethan met her gaze, steady. We split the signs, he explained, keeping his voice low. Half the line stays tight, follows you, leaves almost nothing. The other half, steps heavier, breaks pattern, leaves a trail that looks rushed, careless. It pulls eyes away from the true path. A few of the warriors nearby shifted at that, understanding the risk without needing it spelled out. Nayeli's expression did not change, but her eyes sharpened slightly. You would send some to be followed, she said. Ethan shook his head once. I would send no one alone, he replied. We do not leave them behind. We rejoin after the corridor bends. It is a misdirection, not a sacrifice. Silence followed, not empty, but full, carrying the weight of the choice in a place where choices could not be undone. Nayeli looked past him into the corridor again, then back at the line of her people, measuring, deciding. When she spoke, her voice was quiet, but it carried. She gave instructions in her own language, clear, precise, and the line began to adjust, not breaking, just shifting, dividing with intention rather than fear. Ethan stepped back to give them space, watching the way they moved, the way they trusted her without question, and something in him tightened again, not from doubt, but from the realization that this was no longer just a path he was leading them through. It was a path he had chosen to walk with them. When the two lines formed, Nayeli returned to stand in front of him, closer than before, the space between them now familiar in a way that did not need to be named. You walk with me, she said. Ethan nodded once. I always planned to. For a brief second, her gaze held his, searching for something she did not speak aloud, and whatever she found there was enough, because she turned without another word and stepped into the corridor, the true path hidden in shadow, the false one already beginning to take shape behind them. Ethan followed at her side, the narrow walls closing in again, the air cool against his skin, and as they moved forward, the sound of their passage faded into the stone, leaving behind only the suggestion of something that might lead the wrong eyes the wrong way. The corridor bent sharply after another 100 yards, the walls tightening until even the sound of breathing seemed too loud, and Ethan adjusted his pace again, slowing just enough to keep the line from bunching, his hand brushing lightly against the stone as he moved, feeling the cool surface guide him more than his eyes could in the low light. The split had worked cleanly, cleaner than he expected, and that alone made him uneasy, because things that went too smoothly in places like this often meant the cost had not shown itself yet. Behind them, the false trail would already be settling into the ground, imperfect, uneven, just convincing enough to draw attention without revealing intention, and Ethan knew the kind of men following would see it, would choose it, because it looked like fear, and fear was something they understood better than patience. Nayeli walked beside him without speaking, her steps as measured as his, her attention divided between the path ahead and the faint echoes behind them that only someone listening for more than sound could catch. The air shifted again, a slight current moving through the narrow passage, carrying with it the faint scent of dust disturbed somewhere beyond their reach, and Ethan felt it before he thought it. They found it, he said quietly, not turning. Nayeli did not ask which trail. She did not need to. Then we do not slow, she replied, her voice steady, and there was no hesitation in it, no second thought. The corridor opened just enough for the line to widen slightly, and Ethan used the space, angling them toward a darker edge where the rock dipped inward, creating a shallow cut that ran parallel to the main path, barely visible unless you knew to look for it. He stepped into it without announcement, trusting that those behind him would follow the shift, and they did, the movement flowing through the line like water finding a new course. The ground here changed again, softer, layered with fine sand that held shape for only a moment before settling back into itself, and Ethan felt a small measure of relief at that, because it meant their passage would not linger long enough to be read by eyes that came too late. He crouched briefly, pressing his palm into the surface, then lifting it, watching the imprint blur at the edges almost immediately. Good. He rose again and kept moving. A faint sound reached them then, not from behind but from above, a small shift of stone somewhere higher along the canyon wall, and every head tilted upward for a fraction of a second before returning to the path. It was nothing. Or it was something that chose not to reveal itself. Either way, they did not stop. The passage curved once more, then widened into a low basin carved between the rock, a place where the ground leveled out and the walls offered cover from every side except the narrow entrance they had just passed through. Ethan slowed, lifting his hand again, and the line eased to a stop without breaking its quiet. He turned then, finally, facing them fully for the first time since they had entered the corridor, his eyes moving across the faces closest to him, reading what little the dark allowed. Tired, but steady. Alert, but not panicked. Nayeli stepped forward, stopping within arm's reach, her gaze fixed on his, searching not for direction now, but for certainty. Ethan held it for a moment, then nodded once. "We wait here," he said softly. "Only a short time. Long enough for the other line to circle back." One of the warriors shifted slightly at that, concern flickering in the movement, but Nayeli spoke before the thought could grow, her voice calm, grounded, and whatever she said settled it immediately. Ethan listened without understanding the words, but he understood the effect. Trust held the line together more than any path he could choose. The minutes stretched quietly, measured not by sound but by breath, by the slow return of strength to legs that had carried them farther than expected, and Ethan remained standing, his attention fixed on the narrow entrance behind them, waiting for the first sign that the plan had held. It came not as a sound, but as a shadow, a shape slipping through the dark with the same controlled movement as before, followed by another, then another, until the second line reformed around them, whole again, unbroken. Ethan let out a breath he had not realized he was holding, the tension easing just enough to allow the next step forward. Nayeli saw it, even in the dark. She did not smile. She did not speak. But when she turned to move again, she did not question the direction. And this time, when Ethan stepped forward, the space between them felt different, not smaller, but steadier, as if something unseen had chosen to walk with them now, silent, but certain. They moved again without needing to be told, the line reforming into a single quiet flow that slipped out of the basin and back into the narrow path beyond, the night now deeper, heavier, the sky above reduced to a thin ribbon between stone that offered no light and no guidance, only the sense that time was still moving whether they could see it or not. Ethan led with the same steady pace, but something had shifted in the way he listened, not just for pursuit, but for the land itself, for the subtle signs that told him how far they had come and how much farther they could go before the terrain would demand a different kind of decision. The air grew cooler as they advanced, carrying a faint dampness that had not been there before, and after another few minutes, the sound reached them, soft at first, then clearer, the quiet flow of water moving somewhere ahead, hidden but close enough to matter. Ethan slowed, raising his hand just slightly, and the line responded at once, easing to a near halt without breaking formation. He stepped forward alone for a few yards, angling toward the sound. Then crouched, touching the ground again, feeling the change beneath his fingers, the shift from dry dust to firmer soil that held the memory of water even when it could not be seen. When he stood and turned back, Nayeli was already there, her presence as steady as before, her eyes following the direction of the sound. "A stream," she said quietly. Ethan nodded. "Narrow, but it cuts across our path," he replied. "If we cross it clean, it will take our trail with it." She studied him for a moment, then the ground, then the dark ahead. "Or it will slow us," she said. Ethan did not deny it. "For a few minutes," he answered. "But it will cost them more than it costs us." The choice did not linger long. Nayeli turned slightly, giving a soft instruction in her own language, and the line adjusted once more, preparing to move as one without hesitation. They reached the stream within a minute, the water no wider than 10 feet, moving steady over smooth stones that reflected what little light the sky offered, and Ethan stepped into it first, boots finding purchase without splashing, careful, controlled, each movement designed to leave nothing behind but the disturbance that would vanish with the current. He crossed in 3 steps, then turned, watching as the others followed, each person stepping where the last had stepped, the line maintaining its quiet discipline even in the water. A young girl hesitated at the edge, the cold shock of the stream enough to slow her, and before the moment could stretch into something more, Nayeli moved beside her, not lifting, not rushing, just placing her hand gently at the girl's back, steadying her, and the girl stepped forward, crossing without a sound. Ethan watched it again, that same quiet strength, that same way of guiding without force, and something in him shifted further, not in thought, but in feeling, a recognition that did not need words to take hold. When the last of them reached the far side, he stepped back into the stream briefly, using his hand to disturb the water just enough to blur what little sign remained, then returned to the bank and nodded once. "We move along the edge for a while," he said softly to Nayeli. "Keep the water close. It will confuse the trail." She looked at him, then at the stream, then back at him again, and for the first time, there was something in her expression that was not just calculation or caution. It was understanding. Not of the land. Of him. She gave a small nod, then stepped forward, taking the lead for a few paces as the line adjusted, her path matching his without needing to be shown. Ethan fell in beside her again, not ahead, not behind, and as they moved along the stream's edge, the sound of water covering their passage, the night seemed to settle around them in a different way, no longer pressing, but holding, as if the land itself had decided, for now, to let them pass unseen. The stream curved gently along the base of the canyon, its quiet movement steady against the stillness of the night, and Ethan kept his pace aligned with it, not too close to slip, not too far to lose its cover, each step placed with the kind of care that came from knowing the difference between being followed and being found. The ground here was softer, forgiving in a way the ridge had not been, and the sound of water masked the subtle shifts of movement behind him, the quiet rhythm of many feet traveling as one. After nearly half a mile, the canyon walls began to widen, not enough to expose them, but enough to let the sky open slightly above, a thin stretch of stars breaking through the darkness, faint but constant, and Ethan slowed again, not out of caution this time, but because something ahead had changed. The stream narrowed, its flow slipping between larger stones that rose unevenly from the water, creating small breaks where the current split and rejoined, and beyond it, the land lifted gently into a shallow rise that led away from the canyon floor. Ethan stopped at the edge, studying it, his eyes tracing the slope, the texture of the ground, the way the sand gathered in patches where the wind had shaped it over time. Nayeli stepped beside him, her gaze following his without a word. "We leave the water here," he said quietly. She did not respond immediately. Instead, she looked back once at the line behind them, then forward again, her attention settling on the rise. "Why here?" she asked. Ethan crouched, pressing his hand into the sand at the edge of the stream, then lifting it, watching how quickly the surface shifted back, erasing the mark. "Because the ground changes," he said. "Out there, the wind works faster than feet. By morning, nothing we leave will matter." Nayeli considered that, her eyes narrowing slightly as she read the land the way he did, not just seeing it, but understanding what it would do when they were gone. She gave a small nod, then turned, speaking softly to those closest, the message passing back through the line as it had before, quiet, efficient, unquestioned. They crossed the final stretch of water in silence, each step placed with care, then moved on to the rising ground beyond, the sand shifting underfoot but settling quickly behind them, already beginning to forget they had been there. The canyon walls fell away gradually as they climbed, replaced by open space that felt both freeing and exposed, and Ethan adjusted their path slightly, angling them toward a low formation of rock that broke the line of sight from below without forcing them into tighter ground. The wind moved more freely here, brushing against their clothes, carrying away scent, sound, anything that might linger too long, and for the first time since they had left the valley, Ethan felt the tension in his chest ease just enough to let him breathe deeper. Behind them, the stream disappeared into shadow, its sound fading until it was no longer something they could rely on, and ahead, the land stretched into darkness that held no clear shape, only possibility. Nayeli moved closer again, not out of need, but by choice, her pace matching his without effort, her presence steady at his side. "You have done this before," she said quietly, not as a question, but as something she had accepted. Ethan kept his eyes forward. "I have followed orders before," he replied. She watched him for a moment, then asked, "And now?" Ethan paused just slightly, the smallest break in his rhythm, then continued. "Now I choose the path." The words settled between them, simple, but carrying more than they said. Nayeli did not answer. Right away. She looked ahead, then back at him, and for the first time, there was no distance in her gaze, no barrier left unspoken. Then we follow, she said. Not him. The path. But it was enough. The line moved forward into the open ground, the night holding them in its quiet, and far behind, somewhere beyond the canyon they had left, the faint echo of pursuit faded just enough to become uncertain, as if even those who followed had begun to question where the trail had truly gone. The land opened wider with every step, the canyon now far behind them, reduced to a dark line against the horizon, and the ground beneath their feet shifted into rolling stretches of sand and low brush that moved gently with the wind, leaving no clear path and offering none in return. Ethan slowed slightly, not from fatigue but from awareness, because open ground was different. It did not hide you, it tested whether you knew how to move without being seen even when nothing stood in the way. The stars above grew clearer, spreading across the sky in quiet patterns that did not change, and he used them without thinking, adjusting their direction just a few degrees to keep them aligned with the slope ahead, a subtle shift that would matter more over miles than it did in a single step. Behind him, the line held steady, their movement softer now, lighter, each person instinctively reducing their impact on the land, as if they understood that out here, even the wind could carry a story if you gave it something to tell. Nayeli walked beside him again, her silence no longer distant but present, shared, and for a while neither of them spoke, the quiet between them no longer filled with tension, but with something steadier, something that did not need to prove itself. After nearly a mile, the ground rose gently into a series of low ridges, natural breaks that cast shallow shadows even under starlight, and Ethan guided them toward one of these, choosing the side that faced away from the canyon, away from where pursuit would still be searching for answers that no longer existed. When they reached the crest, he stopped, not raising his hand this time, but simply halting, and the line behind him followed without question. He turned slowly, scanning the horizon they had crossed, his eyes adjusting to distance, to movement, to anything that did not belong, and for a long moment, there was nothing. No dust. No sound. No sign. Just the vast, open quiet of land that had already erased them. He exhaled, slow, controlled, the kind of breath a man takes when he realizes something has ended, even if he does not yet know what begins next. Nayeli stepped forward, standing beside him at the ridge, her gaze following his, her posture relaxed in a way it had not been before. "They are gone," she said quietly. Ethan did not answer right away. He looked a little longer, measuring not what he could see, but what he could not, then gave a small nod. "For now," he replied. She accepted that without argument. The truth did not need to be certain to be enough. Behind them, the line began to ease, not breaking, not scattering, but shifting into something less rigid, the weight of constant movement lifting just enough to allow breath to return, shoulders to lower, the quiet signs of people who had carried more than distance and were now setting some of it down. A small fire would come later, he knew that, carefully placed, carefully shielded, not for light, but for warmth, for something human in a place that asked men to forget they were human at all. Nayeli remained where she was, her attention no longer on the land alone, but on him, and when she spoke again, her voice carried something different, not caution, not command, but something closer to understanding. "You said you were there," she said, not looking away. Ethan's jaw tightened slightly, just enough to be seen if someone was watching for it. "I was," he answered. The words settled between them, heavier now than before, because the distance they had been walking had not erased what came before it. Nayeli studied him, not with suspicion this time, but with intent, as if she was choosing whether to step closer to something that could not be undone. "And you came back," she said. Ethan nodded once. "I did." The wind moved gently across the ridge, carrying the scent of open land, of distance, of something that did not belong to either of them alone, and for a moment, neither spoke again. Then Nayeli turned, looking out over her people, her voice soft as she gave a quiet instruction, and the group began to settle into the space they had earned, not claimed, but reached. Ethan remained where he was, just for a second longer, his eyes still on the horizon, then he turned as well, stepping down from the ridge to stand among them, not apart, not above, just there, in the same ground, under the same sky, where the path ahead no longer belonged to one man alone. The night settled fully over the open land, not as a cover but as a quiet agreement, and the small fire they built did not rise high or bright, just a low circle of warmth held close to the ground, its light barely reaching beyond a few feet, enough to see faces, not enough to be seen from a distance. Ethan stood at the edge of it for a while before stepping closer, not out of habit but because the cold had begun to press through his coat in a way that reminded him he was no longer moving. The people around the fire spoke softly in their own language, voices low, steady, carrying a rhythm that did not need translation to be understood. It was not fear. It was not relief. It was something in between, something earned. Nayeli sat across from him, her posture relaxed but not unguarded, her eyes occasionally lifting from the fire to study him in the same quiet way she had all night, not searching for weakness anymore, but for truth that had not yet been spoken. Ethan crouched slowly, resting his hands near the warmth, the faint crackle of the fire filling the silence between them, and for a moment he allowed himself to feel it, the stillness, the absence of urgency, something he had not trusted in a long time. A small object was placed beside him then, set carefully on the ground within his reach, and he glanced down to see it, a simple cup carved from wood, filled with water drawn from somewhere beyond the ridge. He looked up, and Nayeli met his gaze, her expression steady. She had not handed it to him. She had placed it beside him. The choice was his. Ethan hesitated for only a second before picking it up, the wood warm from the fire, the water cool against his hand, and he took a slow drink, then set it back where it had been, not returning it, not keeping it, just leaving it between them. Nayeli nodded once, a small movement, but enough. The fire shifted slightly, a piece of wood settling into place, and the sparks rose briefly before fading into the night, and in that moment, Ethan reached into his coat, his hand closing around something he had carried longer than he cared to admit. He brought it out slowly, placing it in the space between them, the same way she had placed the cup. The badge. It caught the firelight for a second, the mark on its surface clearer now, the history it carried impossible to ignore. The voices around them quieted slightly, not out of fear, but out of awareness, and Nayeli's eyes moved to it, then back to him. Ethan did not rush his words. "I was there," he said again, his voice low, steady, when men wearing that made decisions that did not belong to them. He paused, not searching for words, but allowing the ones that mattered to remain. "I followed orders," he continued, "because I was told it was the right thing to do." The firelight moved across his face, catching the lines that had not been there before. "But I saw what those orders meant." Silence followed, not empty, but full, holding the weight of what had been said without asking for more. Nayeli did not look away. "And now," she said quietly. Ethan met her gaze, his answer simple. "Now I do not follow them." The wind moved gently across the ridge, carrying the warmth of the fire outward, blending it into the night, and for a moment, no one spoke. Then Nayeli reached forward, not to take the badge, but to turn it slightly, the firelight shifting across its surface until the mark faced down, hidden from view. She left it there, not discarded, not accepted, just changed. "Then you walk without it," she said. It was not a command. It was not a test. It was a statement of what came next. Ethan looked at the badge for a moment longer, then nodded once, not to her, but to himself, and left it where it lay. Around them, the quiet returned. The soft murmur of voices rising again, the fire holding its small circle of light, and for the first time since he had turned his horse toward the valley, Ethan did not feel like he was standing between two worlds. He felt like he had finally stepped into one. The fire burned lower as the night deepened, its glow softening into embers that pulsed with a quiet rhythm, and one by one, the voices around it faded into rest, not sleep exactly, but something close enough for bodies that had carried too much for too long. Ethan remained where he was, not lying down, not fully at ease, his back against a low rock, eyes half lifted toward the horizon where darkness met something just lighter than itself. The land was still. Too still. And he had learned long ago that stillness was not always peace. It was sometimes the space before a choice. He rose slowly without drawing attention, stepping away from the circle of warmth, boots silent against the sand, moving just far enough that the firelight no longer reached him. The wind met him there, cooler now, carrying distance instead of heat, and he stood for a moment, listening, not with urgency, but with intent. Then he heard it. Faint. Far. But real. Not the rhythm of pursuit pressing forward, but something more careful, more patient, like men who had stopped running and started thinking. Ethan closed his eyes briefly, not in fear, but in recognition. They had not lost the trail. They had lost the obvious one. And men who knew how to read the land would not stop at the obvious. Behind him, soft footsteps approached, measured, familiar, and he did not turn. Nayeli stopped beside him, her presence steady as before. "You heard it," she said quietly. Ethan nodded once. "They are not chasing anymore," he replied. "They are searching." The word settled between them, carrying a different kind of weight than before. Nayeli looked out into the dark, her gaze steady, not scanning, but reading, the same way she had read him from the beginning. "Then they will find where we were," she said. Ethan did not deny it. "Yes," he answered. "And when they do, they will start asking why the trail disappeared." A moment passed, quiet, but not empty. Then Nayeli turned slightly, her eyes meeting his. "And you know the answer they will come to." Ethan let out a slow breath. "That someone helped you," he said. She held his gaze a second longer. "And they will look for that someone." Ethan gave a small nod, not as agreement, but as acknowledgement of something already decided. The wind shifted again, brushing past them, carrying the faint echo of distance that no longer felt as far as it had before. Behind them, the fire settled deeper into itself, the last flames giving way to glow, and the people resting there remained unaware, or perhaps simply unwilling to break the quiet they had been given. Nayeli watched him carefully now, not with suspicion, not with distance, but with understanding that had come too quickly to be accidental. "You are thinking of leaving," she said. It was not a question. Ethan did not answer right away. He looked out across the land, the same direction they had come from, the same direction those men would come from, and for a moment, the silence stretched just long enough to hold the truth without words. Then he spoke. "If they find a trail again," he said slowly, "it should not lead here." Nayeli did not move. "You would give them one," she said. Ethan's jaw tightened slightly. "I would give them something to follow," he replied. "Something that looks like a man who walked alone." The idea settled between them, heavier than anything that had been said since the fire was lit. Nayeli studied him, not for weakness, not for doubt, but for something deeper, something that would not change once chosen. "And when they catch it?" she asked quietly. Ethan met her eyes, steady. "They will stop looking for you." The wind moved again, stronger this time, carrying the scent of open land and something else beneath it, something final. Nayeli did not look away. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Then she stepped closer, just enough that the distance between them no longer felt like separation. "You said you choose the path now," she said. Ethan nodded once. "I do." She held his gaze, searching for the part of him that still belonged to the man he had been, and finding less of it than before. "Then this is your path," she said. "Not approval. Not refusal. Just truth." Ethan looked past her for a second, toward the quiet circle behind them, then back to her, and something in his expression softened, not into regret, not into fear, but into something quieter. "It is," he said. The night held them there for a moment longer, the space between choice and action narrowing until there was nothing left to say, and when Ethan finally stepped back, it was not away from her, but toward the direction he had already chosen, the path that would lead him away from the only place that had felt still enough to stay. He did not say goodbye. Out here, words like that did not carry weight, they only slowed a man down when the land was already asking for more than he could give. Ethan moved without looking back, his steps quiet, deliberate, each one placed with the same care he had used all night, but now the direction had changed, no longer away from danger, but toward it. The ground stretched open before him, the faint rise of the ridge behind fading into shadow, and the wind met him head-on, carrying the distant trace of men who had not yet found what they were looking for. He let them find it. That was the point. He angled his path slightly, not straight, never straight, but enough to leave a story in the sand, something readable, something human, a trail that spoke of one man moving with purpose but without fear, a trail that invited eyes to follow. Behind him, the fire would be nothing more than ash by morning. The people would move before the first light touched the horizon. They would be gone in a way the land understood, not hidden, but absorbed. He kept walking. The night did not resist him. It did not guide him either. It simply allowed him to pass. After nearly a mile, he slowed, not from fatigue, but from intention, choosing a stretch of ground where the sand lay loose and open, where the wind had not yet erased the marks of passage. He stepped harder here, less careful, letting his boots press deeper, letting the rhythm of his movement change just enough to suggest urgency, not panic, a man who knew he was being followed and did not mind. He paused once, turning slightly, looking back across the distance he had crossed, not searching for them, but acknowledging what he was leaving behind. The ridge was gone now. Only darkness remained. He nodded once to nothing in particular, then turned again and continued forward. Time passed differently out here. Measured not in minutes, but in distance, in breath, in the steady repetition of steps that carried a man farther than he thought he could go. The first hint of light touched the horizon as he reached a low stretch of ground where the land dipped slightly before rising again, a natural place for men to pause, to look, to decide. Ethan stopped there. Not because he had to. Because it was the right place. He stood still, listening, the wind brushing past him, the silence no longer empty, and after a moment, he heard it. Closer now. Not rushed. Not scattered. Controlled. They had found the trail. Of course they had. He had made sure of it. He did not move. He did not hide. He simply adjusted his stance slightly, enough to face the direction the sound would come from, his posture steady, his breathing even, the kind of stillness that did not belong to a man waiting to run. The light grew slowly, turning the edge of the world from black to gray, then to something softer, and with it came the shape of movement in the distance, faint at first, then clearer, figures breaking the horizon line, following exactly where he had led them. Ethan watched them without expression, not counting, not measuring, just seeing. This was never about how many. It was about where they would stop. He let out a slow breath, the kind that settled something deep inside, then reached into his coat once more, not for the badge, but for nothing at all, his hand coming out empty, open, as if to remind himself that there was nothing left to carry from the man he had been. The wind shifted again, carrying the faint scent of the land behind him, of the place he had left, and for a brief moment, something in his chest tightened, not regret, not doubt, just the quiet recognition of something he had chosen not to return to. Then it passed. The figures in the distance moved closer, steady. Certain, following the path he had given them, and Ethan remained where he was, a single shape against the rising light, not running, not hiding, just standing, as if the land itself had placed him there for a reason that no one needed to explain. The distance between them closed slowly, not rushed, not forced, just the steady approach of men who believed they were following something that would not turn back, and Ethan remained where he stood, the morning light rising behind him, casting a long shadow across the sand that pointed directly toward them, as if the land itself had drawn a line they were meant to cross. He did not reach for anything. He did not step forward. He simply waited, his posture calm, his breathing even, the same stillness he had carried through the night now settling into something final. The figures ahead grew clearer with each passing moment, shapes becoming men, movement becoming intent, their path unbroken, their direction certain, and Ethan watched them without resistance, not measuring their number, not weighing his chances, because this was never about that. It was about where the path ended. The wind moved lightly across the open ground, carrying dust in thin streams that shifted and settled without leaving a mark, and for a brief second, Ethan glanced to the side, not toward the men approaching, but toward the empty horizon behind him, the direction he had come from, the place that no longer held him. There was nothing there. No fire. No trail. No sign that anyone had passed at all. He let his gaze rest there just long enough to feel it, the quiet certainty that the choice had held, that the land had taken what needed to be taken and left nothing behind. Then he turned back. The men slowed as they drew closer, not stopping, but adjusting, their movement shifting from pursuit to recognition, because a single man standing alone in open ground was not what they had expected to find, and for a moment, uncertainty moved through them like a ripple, subtle, but real. Ethan saw it. He said nothing. He did not need to. The space between them closed to a distance where faces could be read, where eyes met eyes, and in that moment, something passed without words, something that did not belong to rank or order, but to the simple understanding of what stood in front of them. Ethan's hands remained open at his sides, empty, unthreatening, and yet there was nothing in his stance that suggested surrender. It was something else. Something quieter. Something chosen. One of the men stepped slightly ahead of the others, not aggressively, but with purpose, his gaze fixed on Ethan as if searching for confirmation of something he already suspected. Ethan met that gaze without hesitation, without challenge, just presence, the kind that did not bend or break because it had already let go of what could be taken. The wind shifted again, brushing past them, carrying the faint warmth of the rising sun, and in that light, the ground between them looked untouched, unbroken, as if the trail had simply ended here for reasons no one could explain. The moment stretched, held between action and stillness, and then, slowly, the men began to look past him, scanning the land beyond, searching for what they had expected to find, and finding nothing. No movement. No sign. No direction to follow. Just open ground and a single man who had led them there. Ethan did not turn when they looked beyond him. He did not speak when their attention shifted. He remained exactly where he was, a quiet answer to a question they had not known how to ask. And in that silence, something changed, not in him, but in them, the certainty that had carried them across miles of land now faltering just enough to break its hold. Because the trail they had followed had not been a path to something. It had been a path away from it. The wind moved once more, stronger now, lifting the loose sand in soft waves that erased what little remained, smoothing the ground into something clean, something final, and Ethan watched it happen without emotion, without regret, just acceptance. Behind him, the world he had chosen to protect was already gone from reach. In front of him, the men who had come to find it stood with nothing left to follow. And in the space between those two truths, Ethan Calloway stood alone, not as a soldier, not as a man bound by orders, but as something simpler, something harder to name. A man who had chosen where the story ended. And left the rest to silence.